All right, so let's continue. Now in this video we're going to focus on access modifiers and getters and setters. And we'll see, maybe we'll get some packages in here as well. Okay, so where did we leave off? Where we left off, we were basically changing, we basically created a humanoid using the default humanoid constructor, and then we created a humanoid using the overloaded humanoid constructor to basically create a humanoid exactly as we wanted, to really fully customize the properties. And we experimented a little bit with kind of changing the name and whatnot. Okay, so let's talk about access modifiers. Okay, so what we have seen, we've seen all the access modifiers here and there before. Okay, you've seen these words public and private. I should say we've seen two of the access modifiers before. We've seen public and private. Okay, so now it's time to actually talk about what public and private mean. Okay, public and private basically dictate who can access these variables or these methods. Okay, so if we go back to like probably the first time we ever did functions, which would have been in Module 2 and Lesson 1. Okay. Basically we see we have this public class. Okay, what this means is anyone can access this class, and by anyone I mean anyone trying to run a Java program. They would have no problem running this class. Okay, likewise this main method inside the class could be run as well. Okay, but if we went down, we saw that we had this private static double get next grade method. Okay, what that means is any other code, Java code that's outside of this file itself cannot access or run this method. Okay, this method, since it is private, can only be run by calling it within this file itself. So you can see up here, get next grade is called in here because it actually exists. The definition for that method exists in this file. Okay, so long story short, I just wanted to show you that we have dealt with this private and public before. There's a third access modifier as well called protected. I'll probably leave that for Lesson 2 to talk. I might mention it a little bit here, but we'll go in depth much more in Lesson 2 because protected, the protected access modifier only comes into play, or specifically comes into play when we're talking about inheritance and things like that. So again, Lesson 2. All right, but let's explore what this really means. Okay, so typically when I have a constructor, I typically actually declare it as public. Okay, because typically I want any code in my project, any other file in my project, to be able to create a new human instance. Okay, so that was true out here in Lesson 1, where I created this humanoid Dr. Dan and this humanoid generic person. Okay, so you can see I can save that. I don't get any errors in my code. If I try to change this to private, okay, you'll see instantly I get an error in this other file because it's basically saying, hey, I'm trying to call this constructor, and constructor is just a special method. You can think of it as a method, but I'm trying to call this constructor, and this constructor is private, which means this code cannot be called from any other file. It just can't be done. Okay, you can see the quick fix. It says, hey, change visibility, and it basically just removes that from me. I don't actually know. It says if we kind of looked at this error, it actually says change visibility of humanoid to package. I'm not sure exactly what that means. I mean, I get what it says in theory. Anything in the same package, which we haven't really talked about what this package is yet. We're actually about to do that pretty soon. But I think it may actually be similar to what's called the protected access modifier as well. But again, these access modifiers, for now, let's just consider private and public. And private and public, private basically means the only code that can actually access this method or constructor, the only code that can access it is code in the same file. Any other code in another file or another class or something like that cannot actually access or call this code. So again, typically for a constructor, I've never seen a private constructor. You pretty much always make it public. Okay, perfect. However, we then have these instance variables. Okay, if you recall, my client file out here, I was actually coming through here and I was changing the name. I had said drdan.name. Okay. If I change all these to public, let's say I just work with public with name for now. You see, if I set the access modifier to the name to public, I don't have any problems. Okay. However, if I change this to private, notice I get an error instantly in my Les1 client. I go back and it basically says, hey, the field humanoid.name is not visible. And it gives me two options. Hey, change the visibility of the name to package or create getter and setter. Basically, it's saying, hey, remove that private tag that you gave it and make it public, or just leave it blank, because I need access to this variable and I can't actually change it. Okay, I can't change it. I also can't even just access it to print out what's there. Okay, and what I want to say about this when it comes to public and private data is if I were in the room right now and I said, hey, can you give me your credit card number? You might look at me a little funny, right? Or if I said, hey, can you give me your social security number or your state ID, right? Whatever that is, you might kind of raise your eyebrow at me and say, what's this guy getting? What's this guy want? He wants to hurt me somehow, right? He wants to steal something from me. Okay? So the idea is that in real life, right, I have some data that's pretty sensitive. Right, I have private information. Right, I might have a piece of information that's my social security number, right, or my state ID. That's private, right? So I would want to protect that. I don't want just anyone to access that, right? So my name might be a private thing too, right? If you're out in public and someone just comes up to you and says, "Hey, what's your name?" You might give it to them, right? It's not super sensitive, but it's a little bit sensitive, right? Especially today, they could look you up on Facebook or Twitter or something like that, and they might actually be able to find where you live and a whole lot of information about you just from your name, right? So for that reason, when we create instance variables, we almost always set everything as private, okay? And there's several reasons that we do that. I'll kind of unpack those in just a moment. But we almost always set everything as private. Now, in reality, right, if you came up to me and you asked me what my hair color was, I would tell you brown because you could see it with your own eyes, right? That's not really a private, sensitive piece of information. Whereas, like I said, the social security number, the credit card number, all that stuff is very much sensitive, private information that I wouldn't want anyone else to get access to, right? So, for instance, I wouldn't want some other file to get access to that. So for privacy reasons, we typically set things as private. But what we'll see in a second is there's also management of data reasons why we set things as private. Okay, so I just set this variable. I set all my variables as private, so now I can't access them. Notice, however, right, in the humanoid file itself, I can still access name. You can see I'm overriding it right here with the parameter name and the no name. Okay. Again, I can access any of these instance variables within the file. I just can't access them directly outside. I can't access to just read, or I can't access to overwrite. What I need to do is I need to create getters and setters. Okay, so getters and setters. Getters and setters, other terminology you might hear for getters is a like accessor, I don't know, maybe accessor, I don't know exactly how it's spelled. You might hear that. Mutators for setters, so you might hear that for setters. There's a few different phrases. I like getters and setters. It's easy to remember, and it rhymes, so that's awesome too. All right, so the idea behind a getter and a setter is it is a public interface to my private information. Okay, so what I typically do is I'll say public string. Okay, I'm gonna create a getter for the name instance variable. Okay, so I'll say public string get name. I'm gonna go ahead and just write this out, and then I'll explain it in just a second. Okay, get name, open close parenthesis, open semicolon, return name. Okay, so all I did was I created a simple method called getName, and I always basically just take the instance variable itself, I add the word get in front of it, and I just capitalize the first letter, right? So getName. And all it does is it basically just returns the name. Okay, so now there's a public getter interface to my private name data. Okay, so if I want to get the name, what I need to do, this generic person, if I come back here, you'll see actually now if I just type the dot here, name no longer even shows up. Okay, if you recall from the past, if name, let's just do homeworld for instance, if homeworld was still private, or I'm sorry, public, you would see when I go to type dot, you'll see homeworld actually pops up, right? Because it's a public, it's accessible. So Eclipse kind of helps you out and shows you what's actually public or at least accessible. But in this case, right, I want to actually call this method getName. I'm going to go ahead and change my homeworld back to private here. Okay, so now I have this getName. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and basically replace everywhere where I saw .name, I'm going to replace it with getName if I'm just trying to get that information. Okay, so .getName. All right, and you can see I also need to do the same for attack. I'm going to go ahead on this, the .name equals, right? I'm not trying to get the name, I'm trying to set the name here. So I'm going to go ahead and just comment out this line for now until we're ready for it. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and create getters for all these methods. Okay, so public string is the return type of the homeworld. Get homeworld, open close parentheses, open semicolon, return homeworld. Okay, so I'll do that for all of these. So public string get attack simply returns the attack. Public string get defense simply returns the defense. Okay, so you should have those four getters now. Get name, get homeworld, get attack, get defense, just each returning those respective instance variables. And now back in my client, I'm going to change attack to .get attack with those open close parentheses. So all three of those places. Get attack. Get attack. Okay, so now when I execute this code, you'll see it's basically going to do the same exact thing. It's going to print out no name has an attack of arm swing, Dr. Dan has an attack of keyboard smack. You'll see it's Dr. Dan both times because I never actually changed the name quite yet. Okay, so let me just jump in the debugger really quickly and show you what's happening. So on this first system.out.print, okay, what's going to happen is I'm going to get to this line. It's going to try to print it, but before it prints it, it needs to basically dive down. It needs to call this method to get the name and get the attack. So what actually happens, you'll see if I hit F5 on my keyboard, it's going to jump down into that get name. Okay, so I basically have this object generic person, and I jump down into that get name, and now I'm in this, right? And well, this person's name is no name. So it actually returns that no name, and then it jumps down. If I hit F5 again, it's going to go and get the attack from that get attack method. So it says, all right, well, what's this person's attack? Well, it's arm swing. Okay. And so thus it'll be able to print out no name and arm swing right there. Okay, so that's basically what's happening in the debugger if you want to actually look at the code and how it's functioning. Okay, so why did I do that? That seemed really pointless, right? That seemed kind of meaningless. You know, I had a really nice, easy way to get the name, right? I mean, if you just look at these two lines of code that we had, where we just had name and attack, okay, this was a lot shorter, right? It was more to the point. It's easier to read. I have these words get and the extra parentheses that didn't really add anything, right? It just kind of made the syntax a little bit harder to write and more characters and things like that, okay? And the answer is that there was really no reason to do this quite yet, okay? Especially because of what I'm about to do with the setters, okay? Let me actually hold on this thought for explaining why we do this. I actually want to create the setters first, and once we're done with the setters, then I'll kind of come back to this concept of why did we even do these getters and setters, because what you'll probably kind of figure out is initially we didn't actually add any protection to our data. Okay, so let's go ahead and do the setters, and we're going to do a similar pattern here. So for my setters, I'm going to say public instead of get, or instead of string. I'm actually not returning data. I'm setting data. I'm passing data in. So I'll say return type is always void for a setter, at least typically. And then I'm going to say set name. Okay, and this time I'm actually going to pass in a parameter. And I'm going to set the name, so I'm going to pass in a string parameter. I'll call it pname, very similar to how I created my humanoid overloaded constructor up here. I'm going to do the exact same thing. You actually see this exact line of code is going to be in there. Okay, so set name, and then I can come up here and I can say name equals pname. Okay, and then I'm going to do that 4 times. Okay, I'm going to say public void set homeworld, and I'm going to pass in a string p homeworld, and then inside that method homeworld equals p homeworld. Public void set attack string p attack open close parentheses, and then attack equals p attack, and then finally public void set defense, pass in a string called p defense. Okay, and then defense equals p defense. Okay, so I have these setters, and again I'm just gonna kind of use them a little bit before I actually explain them and some of the benefits, some more of the benefits. Okay, so I have this lesson 1, and I'm gonna come in here now, and I'm going to uncomment. Actually, I'll just write a line below. Okay, and what I'm gonna say here is I'm gonna say Dr. Dan dot set name. Okay, and then I'll go ahead and I'll say, hey, look, we're friends by this point. We know each other. No need for the formalities. Don't call me Dr. Dan, just call me Dan. Okay, now when I run this, we'll see that it did in fact change, right? Dan has an attack of keyboard, right? So if I wanted to jump into my debugger to just kind of show you what's happening here again, I'll set a breakpoint right on that set name variable. And when I run this in my debugger, you'll see I have Dr. Dan, the Dr. Dan object or instance, and it has these properties that were given from the constructor, the default constructor. Now when I come into this Dr. Dan, if I hit F5 on my keyboard, I'm going to jump down into that getter, or I'm sorry, that setter. It takes in this parameter of Dan, and it's about to overwrite the name, right? It's about to overwrite this dot name with the parameter name that I just passed in. So if I run this line of code, you'll see that exactly that happens. So now this person's name got changed. So now when I jump out of this, you'll see that Dr. Dan was changed, right? The name just changed. And then you'll see that reflected, obviously, when it gets printed out. Okay, perfect. Why did we do that? Okay, so the first answer is that we just typically always want to assume our data is private. You kind of want to assume, like, when you're creating classes, just kind of assume that you're in the FBI or the CIA or something like that, right? And every piece of information you know is a need-to-know type of thing. All right, I think it's better to assume that something is private or secret rather than to assume that everything, right? It's better to assume that everything is like sensitive, secret, private information, and then if you absolutely need to, you make it public. Okay, so pretend like you are a CIA or FBI agent when you're creating these code classes. right? Much better than assuming everything's public and then get it wrong and then someone accesses your data in a way that they really shouldn't have had access to, or get some information that they really shouldn't have known. So that's just kind of a good strategy in general. So to protect our information, and then this is our way of basically saying, hey, we're actually going to tell you the answer. Now, if someone said to get my name, I might decide that that's a sensitive piece of information, okay? And instead, I'm going to return, I ain't telling you, right? I could do that. Okay, so now you'll see whether it's this generic person or whether it's Dr. Dan, I ain't telling you, right? I ain't telling you has an attack of arm swing. I ain't telling you has an attack of keyboard smackdown. So basically what I've done is, you can think about this variable up here, right? The instance variable as the actual data. This is my actual name. This getName method is basically my public response to when someone asks me my name, right? If someone comes up to me, there's no possible way I can stop them from asking me what my name is, right? They're at some point going to call this method, hey, I'm going to get your name, right? And they do that by asking me, hey, what's your name? But what's inside these curly braces is up to me, right? This is how I respond. Do I just actually tell them no matter what? Or do I just by default never tell them, right? And I say, I ain't telling you. Okay, so that's kind of one implementation. I could do a lot of things here, right? I could actually make this getter a little bit more complex. I could say string, right? Depends who's asking, right? Like who is asking, right? So maybe I actually force them when they call get name. Let me go ahead and save this. When they call get name, they actually have to tell me, right? Your mother. Your mother is asking you. Since it's your mother, right? I could write a line of code here. If who is asking is equal to your mother, then tell the name. Else, I ain't telling you, right? So we could do all kinds of interesting things to basically protect our data. For now, we're not going to do that. We're just kind of going to set up the basic structure. Again, when I just unconditionally return your name, right? And when I actually just unconditionally allow them to set my name, it's the same as just having a public string name up here. But for basically kind of good convention's sake, you just always create these getters and setters, and some of them you'll actually do a little bit extra logic like we just talked about. Similarly, for the set name, maybe I will do something very similarly, right? So I might actually say, hey, if you try to set the name and the name has, like, maybe I want to do something very like some basic data checking. I could say if pname dot is blank. Okay, so blank returns true if the string is empty or contains only white space. So if the name is blank, then what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to say name equals, and then maybe I'll just grab my my no name type of thing. So no name. Okay. Else, right? If they don't give me a blank name, then I'll go ahead and actually just change it to what they say it is. So you can use these setters as well for some basic data checking, right? Because if someone's just writing code out in the client, they execute this, you'll say, hey, Dan, right? That set name worked, but let's just say they put a bunch of spaces in there. Then it's at least going to change it to no name. It's going to at least give it something rather than just printing out like a space and then kind of starting the sentence with the word has. So anyway, so that's kind of one thing that we can do with the getters and the setters. And so the getters and the setters are basically used to encapsulate my data. Is typically the phrase you'll hear, encapsulation. Just kind of wraps itself around these instance variables. Typically, we don't really do anything with these getters and setters. We'll kind of just make them public, and they're just public interfaces that don't really protect the data at all, because usually I do want access to my data throughout my program. But if I want to, I can protect this data and only allow access to, in certain situations, or I can protect when someone's trying to update a piece of data I can protect my data so it's only modified in certain ways. All right, so typically a little just convention's sake for getters and setters, since they're so simple. Now this is like, I don't know if this is like official, I don't know if this is like official people do this, but I do it. I think it looks nice and it's kind of cleans up your code a little bit. For getters and setters, I tend to put them on one line, especially when it's just a return statement or an assignment statement. So what I'll do is I'll kind of delete and I'll just kind of leave a space in between each of these curly braces. Oops. And I think what you'll see is my code just looks really nice when I do this. Okay, now for this if statement, I typically wouldn't do that, right? Because it has multiple lines, but I'll come back to that in just a second. Okay, so again, I typically wouldn't compress this to one line because you don't want to have like if, you could do it, right? But it would just look terrible. But if I actually look at this, I can compress this to one line using the ternary operator, right? So really all this line is doing is it's saying name equals pname dot is blank, okay? And then the ternary operator, right, that question mark. So if that's true, then I say no name, else if it's false, pname, okay? And that way I can delete this whole if else statement. I can compress those 4 lines down to 1 so that this actually isn't such a crazy thing to do after all. Okay, so now what we'll see when I play this, it works properly, right? If I have Dan, however, if I come and put some more spaces in there, then you'll see it does replace that with no name. So that ternary operator is functioning exactly like we would expect. Okay. All right, so that's getters and setters in a nutshell. So when we come back in the next sub video or the next sub lesson, we're going to take a look at some of the methods that we can override. We'll talk about the object class just a little bit, and then we'll look at the specifically the toString and the equals class, and we'll build out our main just a little bit more. All right, so I'll see you in the next video.